here to the front if you'd like to sit down. Or you can stay standing if you're more comfortable doing that. Hello everybody, my name is Michelle Connolly. Thank you for coming tonight. Before we get started, I would like to introduce Elder Edie Frederick from the Clayton Tenay Nation.
So what I said is hello, and it's a very good evening out there. There's some stars out. So Michelle invited me tonight to do the welcoming. My name is Edie Frederick. I'm a member of the local nation here in Prince George called Hammond. So what Clayton Tenay translates into is Hatley is the confluence of the two rivers. Naturally, it's the Nechako River and the Fraser River. So our village was located at the confluence, so that's why we are called that. So people of the two rivers. So tonight's topic is the future of forestry. So in our language, we say Naste Chanto Wadeza. So Naste is into the future, Chanto is the forest, Wadeza is, it just emphasizes the future, you know, the time of the future forestry. That's what it translates into. So I hear a lot of good things happening as I was coming in. I was talking to a gentleman, and your work that each and every one of you are doing, contributing to saving our forests, is a very vital role. And sometimes it's not a popular role or responsibility to take up. And I applaud each and every one of you for doing this, because our forestry is really at the brink of almost extinction, just like our language in Clayton. You know, we're down to 2 fluent speakers, which is my mom and my uncle. And I'm a language teacher, one of 2 language teachers in Clayton. So my work is revitalizing the language, and Michelle here is helping me at the office doing that. All the techie stuff she's taught me. So in our culture, the trees play a very vital role in our culture. It's a form of medicine, especially the trees that are around the mountains or on the mountains. Those are the most powerful trees that make powerful medicines, are the ones that are on the mountains, so just keep that in mind. In our language, we don't have a word for tree. We say the chun for wood, but every tree has a name, like fir, tu, cottonwood, landus, and it comes from the legend, the tree legend that we have. So how this legend goes is Astas, he's our trickster and shapeshifter, So he was the only one with a fire, who had fire in the land. And back in that time, the trees could speak to one another. You know, they could speak to the grass and the bushes. You know, in Native spirituality, the basis of Native spirituality, we believe that every living thing on this earth has a spirit, right down to the little worm. You know, that's the basis of our spirituality. But anyway, how the legend goes is that Estes had to leave one day to go somewhere to do something, and he needed somebody to watch over the fire so it won't go out. So he called on the trees. You know, there was the needle people, and they had nice long needles, you know, and there was the leaf people, and they had really nice long leaves on them, and their bark, you know, and all was really nice, and they looked really nice. And so Estes gave them the responsibility to keep that fire going while he went. So he left, and arguments started between the giants and the trees, the landules and the tsul, the cottonwood and the fir. And they were arguing who's going to be the one to keep that fire going. The fir, tsul, I can keep the fire going because I've got really nice pitch and the fire can burn hot. And then landules, the cottonwood tree, said, no, I can keep the fire going because I can, the fire can smolder for a long time. So this kept on back and forth. Pretty soon they started fighting, and the fight was on, and you know, and all the little bush people, they all gathered around to watch the fight, you know, and pretty soon they started fighting, and they were rolling around, and they rolled on top of the fire, and pretty soon they came to their senses, like, and the fight stopped, and Estes came back and asked, what happened? What happened to you guys? You all look different. You don't have nice long needles anymore, it's short and stubby. And the leaf people, you know, you don't look nice anymore. All your leaves are all shrunken. And, you know, he noticed the difference. And none of them said a word. They didn't say a word to this day. Now, the only thing you can hear is when the wind blows through the needle people, all you can hear is a whoosh sound. And then when it blows through the leaf people, it's just a rustling sound. So only a few people nowadays can actually talk to the trees. Have you ever heard of the tree hugger? They're special people because they can talk to the trees. Have you ever heard of people talking to their plants? Well, there you go, see. And that's the legend of our tree legend, and that's why it's so important, you know. As time went on, we used to do controlled burning, you know, to make sure that our berry patches would grow next year. We couldn't do things like that. You know, if we were allowed to keep that practice up, we wouldn't have a beetle problem. We wouldn't have forest fires, you know. It's just something that I'll leave you with that thought. And Kabes Nachaya for listening to me.
setting that important context for us here in Lheidli territory and teaching us some words in the Lheidli dialect. So Conservation North is the organization that's hosting this event tonight. We're a 100% volunteer-run group, so the money for this event came from donations. I would like to thank our steering committee, Keaton Friel, Ivy Struther, Kate Logan, Kristen Keita, and Jen Matthews for organizing this. We have another public event tomorrow night at Trench Brewing at 7:30. The provincial government has an open engagement on old growth management, so they have an online questionnaire, and we are bringing people together for a fun night of filling out a questionnaire on computers, but also launching, debuting a short film that is based on some of the drone footage that we've collected over the past few years. So with that, I would like to introduce Herb Hammond. I first read Herb Hammond's important book, Seeing the Forest Among the Trees, about 20 years ago when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and Herb Hammond remains a very important figure in the world of forest ecology and forestry in BC, and it's a real pleasure to have you here, Herb. So Herb is a registered professional forester and a forest ecologist with 40 years of experience in research, industry, teaching, and consulting. And currently he does work through the Silva Forest Foundation. He's best known for his concept and application of nature-based planning, which he formerly referred to as ecosystem-based conservation planning. Herb defines nature-based planning as the protection and ecologically responsible use of ecosystems through all scales of time and space. Herb works primarily with Indigenous people and other rural communities, and has developed more than 25 ecosystem-based conservation plans across Canada and in other parts of the world. He was the author of, as I mentioned, Seeing the Forest Among the Trees, The Case for Holistic Forest Management, which won the Roderick Haig Brown Prize in 1992, and Maintaining Whole Systems on Earth's Crown, Ecosystem-Based Conservation Planning for the Boreal Forest, which I recently borrowed and I'm still working my way through right now. With that, I'd like everybody to warmly welcome Herb Hammond.
I've heard of being wired, so okay. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thanks to the Lheidli elder for her welcome. I'm sorry she isn't here because I'd like to start by first of all acknowledging that we're here tonight on unceded Lheidli land. I have to say that I've been coming to Prince George for something in the order of 40 plus years, and I never come here that I don't think about how I would have loved to have been here 200 years ago at the confluence of these two rivers. I think that there's a lesson in that for me, and that's that it's so easy to forget that we don't really know what we've lost, and we live in a world where we continue to inherit progressively degraded ecosystems thinking they're normal and natural, and we need to give ourselves a shake about that because it's digging a hole that is not a good one, and as wise people have reminded us that if you're in the bottom of a hole, the best thing to do is stop digging, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. A couple of just general thoughts before we start. I'm going to talk about issues, not personalities. I happen to be a person that doesn't believe there are very many inherently evil people out there. I think we all get cast a lot in life and sometimes don't question it. A lot of times don't question it because we get disempowered in different ways and systems. So I want you to keep that in mind. We're also going to talk about a lot of endemic problems that have been here a long time and are things that we now really urgently need to deal with. I also think that when I talk a little bit about change, I want you to keep in mind that change isn't always a neat, tidy process. Anyone who has spent time in forest ecosystems knows that change there isn't always some linear, nicely planned out process. Sometimes it can be kind of messy. And I think that we need to be prepared for the fact that there aren't linear solutions to what we're going to talk about tonight. That those solutions are things that need to, first of all, I think, start from our hearts. And I will mention that a little bit more as I go along. The other thing I want to acknowledge at the beginning is that I have had the privilege of working with Indigenous people for over 40 years across this country and sometimes elsewhere in the world. And I owe them a huge debt of thanks in many, many different ways. What I'm going to talk to you about tonight, particularly our planning system that we call ecosystem-based conservation planning and more recently nature-based planning, much of the elements of that come from what I've learned from Indigenous people. And chief among that has been their way of knowing, observation-based knowledge. Observation-based knowledge is a very powerful, holistic way of seeing the world and understanding it. And it's not, it's very different than a scientific way of being and knowing that is a reductionist, technically oriented system that doesn't do very well at seeing big pictures and doesn't do very well at seeing whole pictures. So I really, I think back to a mentor of mine, James Gosnell, who hasn't been with us for a long time, but the great Niska leader who I had the privilege of spending a lot of time with. And what I learned from him was not only talking to trees and talking to ecosystems, but probably the most important thing that I learned from him is that the best thing to do is connect your heart to your brain. And he always used to remind me when I was involved with the Niska for many years that when we gave speeches, that those speeches had to come from the heart. So I hope that I can honor James' teaching for you tonight. So that's a little bit of the beginning thoughts that I have. I want to start by reminding us that we need to think about big pictures, and I could put in parentheses or with a dash there, little pictures, in space and time. We as a species and as human beings are not very well equipped to deal with ecosystems, particularly big forest ecosystems or very tiny forest ecosystems. So we have a really important challenge here that we need to face, and that's that seeing those pictures in space and time, it doesn't fit us very well. So we have to learn how to do that, and I'll show you a few tricks about that tonight. This is a picture of the Anzac Valley, and we can ask ourselves the question, are we talking about an exploitive view of space and time, or are we talking about a precautionary view? That's our choice, and that's a choice that increasingly is becoming more and more urgent to make the right choice. So we can change that. We can change the story, and we can change that picture. So I also want to, I feel flooded daily by the latest UN report on what's going on in the world. And just before I came here, I learned that the IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services at the UN, is releasing another report. It's not going to be released formally until May, but these are a few pieces of it, and that are important kind of backgrounds for what I'm going to say here. We're a small part of this system. In fact, we're 0.01% of life on Earth. And we have had an effect on this place far outweighing our portion. This is kind of the current look at the loss of natural systems and the loss of what we call ecological integrity in systems. 85% of the wild land animals are either gone or hanging by a thread. 80% of marine mammals, 50% of plants, and 14% of fish. We could go on with insects and things like that that have a similar picture. Add to that biodiversity crisis, the climate emergency, which it's not my intent to spend lots of time talking about this particular aspect of it right now, but, oops, let me just go back here. This is, to me, this picture of the greenhouse effect or earth imbalance. We had 200 parts per million of CO2. Now we have more than 415 parts per million of CO2, and that's the highest in 800,000 years. Well, we haven't been around that long. So it would be wise for us to ask the question, are we going to be around if we keep doing that? So these are two quotes from that yet unpublished report, which I thought from the UN, and the kind of warnings that keep coming at us, that land degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change are three different faces of the same central challenge, the increasingly dangerous impact of our choices on the health of our natural environment. Pretty plain language and pretty clear. And this was an interesting thing that I've had the privilege to have known for a long time, thanks to the path that I've walked down. But this is the director of this UN report being surprised that indigenous values and from older cultures protect nature much better. There's another important lesson there that we need to synthesize and wake up to. So what's the timber industry's response to this? As far as I can tell, it's the same old, same old. And it is the timber industry. It's not the forest industry. There's no industry that I know of that can make a forest. In fact, none of us know how they work. So it's another clever use of words to talk about the forest industry. Forestry, right now, unfortunately, is about forest destruction. And it does not have to be that way. I have been a forester for a long time, and I've helped and participated in a lot of places, which I'll show you a few pictures of, where it isn't about forest destruction. Edward O. Wilson is one of the people that coined the term biophilia, which I really like because what he's saying, and a lot of wise people, particularly indigenous cultures, are telling us, is that we need nature, natural systems. We're part of them and they're part of us. And so if we identify with that, then we can start accommodating how people meet their needs, how jobs are created. But if we start from a place that we know better, and we're going to manage ecosystems that we don't understand, then we end up in some of the places that you've seen a brief glimpse of here. So really what we're talking about is not managing forests or managing ecosystems. What we're talking about is managing our activities in those ecosystems that sustain us. And it's an arrogant assumption to think that we know how to manage those systems. So, a few pieces of background before we get into the meat of this. So, this is the title that I chose here tonight, Intact Forests to Degraded Fiber Farms, a story of privatized public forests. And I hope how to change the story. We can do that. And I hope I can show you a few ways that we can do that. But I have to start with forest ecosystems. Trees are a critically important structural element of the forest. And it's fair to say that you can't have a forest without trees. But you also can't have trees without a forest. And forests are full of big things. They're full of little things under your feet, like this redberry and feather moss in a boreal forest. They're just as important as the trees. And we're just beginning to understand some of the connections and their importance in how the system works. Or these woodland caribou in an aspen coppice. This Bev Doolittle, the artist that some of you may be familiar with, every time I was walking along in this aspen coppice doing some ecosystem inventory work, and for quite a while I felt like, gosh, I don't think I'm alone here, not that I thought I really was, but then I became aware that I'd been kind of walking in a parallel path with these caribou that were just picking their way through that system. And I still marvel at how little impact they were having in that system, and how much they had to teach me, as well as that amazing species, aspen, that is the most widely spread tree in North America. For me, the work that I do always starts and ends with water. And water starts with drops. Water starts with drops, and it multiplies in the system. It's best illustrated like this photograph of a spider's web with dewdrops on a fall day. And that water connects everything. It's Earth's veins and arteries is a good way to think about it. And I always think of forests as a living fabric of water. And so when we start thinking down the climate change biodiversity loss tube or tunnel, we're losing water. And that right away goes back to the drop and the way that drop multiplies through the system. And so if we don't take care of that water, we're going to lose the system. Just like all of us know as human beings, like any living organism, we're about 70% water or we're not alive. And the same thing applies to that forest fabric. Think of it as a fabric held together by water. Think about the ecological integrity being a woven fabric with the threads that hold it together being water. So, intact forests, another place where indigenous people have known for centuries, if not millennia, that they provide the ecosystem services of air, water, biological diversity, carbon sequestration and storage, and they better than any other system. And the same thing is still true. Science has caught up with that observation-based knowledge, and there is a plethora of science that supports that. So they're the best at water conservation, they're the best at carbon collection and storage, and they have the highest levels of biological diversity. And not surprisingly, for a lot of people here, I'm sure, old growth forests do that the best. So another thing to say about water that always humbles me is that it's alive. And if you don't think it's alive, then you're not alive. Anyone who has knelt down next to a fresh brook in an intact ecosystem and had a drink, or listened to the water. I have the privilege of living next to a river where I go to bed at night, open the window and can listen to the water, knows that it's alive. Water has an amazing life and an amazing power to transmit the essence of life. Or it can magnify and transmit our mistakes. Right now, there's a lot of that going on. And we act as though there was some act of nature that when we have floods, when we have droughts, things like that. No, that's not managing us. So whether it's going to provide the essence of life or magnify our mistakes and transmit them is our choice. Another important piece of the web of forest ecology is decayed wood. Decayed wood is quite simply nature's water storage and filtration system. A healthy watershed of moderate size has billions of tons of decayed wood in it. If it doesn't, it starts losing its ability to function and to maintain that forest web that's held together by water. It's also an amazing foundation for future soil. As you'll see in a moment, it's also a primary location for soil fungi, for mushrooms, for the fungi that literally tie the forest together. So those fungi, the fruiting body of a Boletus mushroom there, are keystone species. Their hyphae, or roots if you want to think about it that way, wrap around all the rest of the roots in a forest. They graft onto the roots, take the photosynthates, the sugars and carbohydrates that come from photosynthesis from green plants, use them for their energy, but in turn provide the water and nutrients that those plants need to continue carrying on photosynthesis and storing carbon. Big thing to do these days. It's been going on for a long time, but it's got a new importance to us. So you think about that single fruiting body and the hyphae or roots of those fungi that tie everything together. They literally make the forest into one organism. So when you change what we call the composition or the parts and the structure, how those parts are arranged in a forest, when you change the composition and structure of trees in a forest, you change the composition and structure of the fungi, of the way the system functions and works together. The problem is that there is so many interconnections in that system that we don't instantly see the folly of our ways. We tend to think that because, it seems to be working the same way it did before I did this, that's true. It's never been true. But we don't have the patience to deal with those scales that I talked about, the tiny to the large landscape through time. So let's come back to water and talk about watersheds. If we're going to be part of things, we need to be part of things as managing our activities in watersheds. A watershed is a drainage basin. And watersheds are either as small as every little crease on Earth, or they're all of Earth. So whatever you do out there can impact or destroy multiple watersheds. And that's a really important thing to think about, because clear cuts wipe out a lot of watersheds. And that multiplies with either observation-based knowledge or scientific-based knowledge to affect larger watersheds. And so there's a lot of humility with which to approach managing watersheds. This is a boreal forest picture that David Dodge gave me some time ago. You can see every one of these little creases in here. These are little watersheds. They flow into bigger watersheds, which flows into the Athabasca River. There's just an example in a quick look at it. The thing that we've got to think about are three variables: water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. All three of those things, if we manage our activities right, should remain relatively unaltered after we're done being part of that system. We've done an abysmal job of that. Absolutely abysmal, not just in British Columbia, but across this country and around the world, because we don't respect those kinds of simple principles. Things like timber, minerals, tourism, urban development need to be seen as byproducts. Water is an essential service. These are not essential services. We can figure out other ways to meet our needs, particularly at the level that we're currently doing them. So this is Caribou-Chilcotin country. This is an example of forestry that, oops, this thing seems to suddenly, oh, there we go. I guess it's hidden behind a water glass there. So clear cuts are lost opportunities. They contribute to global heating and the climate emergency. No way around that. I mean, to argue other than that is just fly in the face of logic and science. So doing this is turning forests. In this photo, in the Caribou-Chilcotin, in the back end of it, in the south, along the mountains that separate the Yalakan Valley from the Chilcotin Plateau, in very, very marginal timber. I mean, the trees that, a big one is 10 centimeters in diameter. You know, that's sustainable forestry? I don't think so. A lot of those trees are upwards of 200 years old. So we're rapidly turning what was carbon sinks into microphones that don't work. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. I'll just continue on. If you can't, let me know, and we can. I don't know if it's that or me, but so we're not only changing carbon sinks to carbon sources, but we're also changing that system from a biologically rich system. In this case, wonderful moose habitat. Not a good place to grow trees, but a very high level of habitat diversity, from small wetlands to closed canopy uplands that provide winter habitat for them. So we've changed that biological diversity to something that's very biologically impoverished. And you don't need to study that. I mean, all you need is a good picture of what the natural character and condition of that landscape, or character of the landscape is. And if it is not that, then you're going to have those problems. So there's a couple of organizations that have employed scientists and different people to study clear cutting. Clear cutting deforests the land. We need to use that word with clear cutting because it is removing the forest. It's not, and if we then think planting a tree is reforesting the land, then we misunderstand that word. You can plant a tree, but you can't plant a forest. All those things that I've been talking about don't go into a plug that you stick in the ground. That composition and structure, that interconnectedness, that water, that decayed wood, all of those pieces that make that system work don't. So we're talking about reducing sequestration, removing natural climate resilient forests. That's information put out by both the Dogwood Alliance for North Carolina and Sustainable Economy in Portland, Oregon. Similar quotes I could pull out of Canadian literature too. These just were two very clear ones. And if you compare that with nature's baseline, again, the industrial forest landscape sequesters less carbon in some cases as much as greater than 70% less carbon than plantations, and emits more carbon into the atmosphere. So we're setting up a climate change crisis with what we're doing. Here's the thing that continues to puzzle me too, is that if planted trees that we put out there survive global heating, which is a big question, I've already seen examples of where that isn't happening, and develop near natural biological diversity. Didn't say natural because I think you're going to be missing a lot of pieces. We're talking about, whether you're talking about a boreal forest or an inland rainforest or a coastal temperate rainforest, somewhere in the order of 150 to 250 years to get back to nature's baseline. What has the IPCC told us? 12 more years, you know? So we're missing a piece there. This is a picture of the boreal rainforest, the Anzac River, which, thanks to Michelle and Conservation North, provided me. These are globally significant for biological diversity, water conservation, carbon sequestration, and storage. They aren't about they aren't and should not be viewed primarily as timber supplies.
Perfect, I think your battery's going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to change the letter? We should probably.
Can you hear me in the back? Can I continue going on here? Okay.
It was better before.
Okay. We'll see if we can get that fixed.
Yeah. I really don't want that to happen again. That's off.
Batteries. Can you give me that? All right. How's that? No? How's that? No? Hello?
Wait. No.
Hello? No? Okay, I apologize that if I may try your hearing there, but maybe we should, while we're wrestling with this technology, move along. So, this is what's happening with those boreal rainforests. Again, Anzac River watershed. Again, not respecting the ecosystem services that come from it. But what bothers me too about this as a forester is this is called site-specific forestry. More site-specific clear-cut forestry. More forest destruction. All in the name of something that was carefully thought out. It doesn't take much imagination to do that. And in my opinion, it doesn't take a lot of thought to say something's haywire here. And sadly, those kinds of activities are pushing the deep snow woodland caribou to the brink here. And we need, either we need to be honest and say that's what our objective is and we don't care, or stop pretending that what we're doing is going to fix it, or stop doing one or the other. So another thing that's happened and really shaped the landscape, not only around Prince George, but throughout BC, is salvage logging. I could spend a whole evening talking to you about my experiences with salvage logging, but I would recommend a book called Salvage Logging and Its Ecological Consequences, published by Island Press and written by David Lindenmeyer, Phil Burton of this area, and Jerry Franklin. And what they sum up in their conclusion is a really simple thing to know about salvage logging. It virtually never contributes in a positive way to ecological recovery. Generally, it can be viewed as a tax on ecological recovery. Dead trees are not wasted in a forest. A burned forest is still a forest. It still has the composition and structure to recover. It still has decayed wood, which is the main carryover mechanism for those fungi that tie the whole system together. So let's stop pretending that it's waste. It's just another form of forest. And it's something that we need to respect, as the scientists have pointed out. The other thing that we get into, okay, all right, is something that this is in the wet end of the interior temperate rainforests, and this is classified as logging waste. Well, I would say it's a waste of old-growth biological diversity, water conservation, carbon sequestration and storage. We've lost essential forest parts and processes that I just touched on a little bit tonight: water, biological diversity. In this example, there is measurements that show that as much as greater than 70% of the carbon stores are lost through this. So, not a good decision. And you know what? I think that I learned from indigenous people, and I learned from my own experience in forests, that we lose the spiritual sustenance that we all rely upon. A good example of that is forest bathing, certainly becoming very popular in North America, something well known in Japan for decades. So this is building an ecological and social debt, and we need to see it as that. We need to, and I don't want to monetize it because it has values way beyond money, but we need to see it as a debt that we can't recover because we don't know how to do what's lying in that pile right there. So this is from a Sierra Club report, a fairly recent one, that documents how across BC we move from carbon sink to carbon sources. It's too late at night to dwell deeply on numbers, but this is 2015, which at the time of the report, and still is one of the more current years that have been summarized by government, that's what was reported: 63 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions. Unreported forest emissions in that year were 67 million tons. That was a very small fire year. Wildfire is not a big part of that number at all. By far the biggest part of that number is forests that were logged. And this was the prediction for 2017. For 2017. I got confused between two 17s there. That the 2017, because it was a big wildfire year, you add that to this, which was essentially without wildfire, and now look where you are compared to the reported emissions. So the main messages are forest emissions are the largest single source of carbon. We spend millions of bucks advertising for the right cars, and okay, that's fine, you know, we need to change that, I don't disagree. But nobody talks about that and makes that connection with forestry. Forest emissions, in many cases, often exceed all other emissions put together. And that's cutting down that carbon sequestration and carbon storage factory of intact forests. Wildfire is going to grow because of the climate change and the loss of biological diversity. So that's going to continue to increase those emissions, which is part and parcel to how we choose to manage those forests. So let's move away from this for a minute and think about the public interest. There's a lot of rhetoric about we do what we do to protect the public interest. Well, here's my thoughts about the public interest. The public interest, to me, is first and foremost about truths, or what I would choose to call essential realities. What are essential realities? They're not assumptions of convenience. They're something that is obvious, like high quality water in moderate flows. We need that. We need air purification. We need carbon sequestration and storage. We need high levels of biological diversity. And as the UN is pointing out in that little quick intro I did to their most recent report, all of those things are woven together in what we do out there. And we need to focus on needs, not wants. We've really gotten that seriously confused in the developed parts of the world. Not just in British Columbia, but the developed parts of the world. What's a need? Well-being, health, and meaningful work. Definitely, we all need those things. Those are needs. But we can achieve those needs in a different way. So really, the public interest is how to survive as part of nature, not remaking nature in a false image, one that is neither supported by observation-based knowledge or scientific knowledge. So how does the public interest get defined by timber companies and forest professionals? Well, they'll tell you it's enshrined in government legislation and policy. I get told that all the time. That's don't criticize what we're doing here. We're just following the legislation and policy that was passed by an omniscient government that knows what's good for us all. Okay, and all that really is doing is reflecting the wants of the strongest special interest group. That's what it represents, not truths, not the kind of needs that I was talking about. Things like corporate lobbies, which in spite of their shrinking importance economically in the province, they have a major influence. The Council of Forest Industries, the Interior Lumber Manufacturers Association, and others. The BC Chief Foresters Leadership Council are all the chief foresters of the timber companies. Where are the biologists? Where are the ecologists? Where are the community representatives? There's no standards and therefore no accountability, and that's what we call professional reliance. Wow. I mean, if anything makes my blood pressure start going off in my head, it's that one. It's one of the most Orwellian concepts that I have ever thought of, and I came across this quote by George Orwell that says, "The people will not revolt. They will never look up from their screens." That was written in 1948, you know. Well, I think we need to look up from our screens. And unfortunately, it's supported by the professional association through silence and the government, and saying to the government, tell us what you want to manage. Where's the professionalism in that? Sorry, but it loses me there. So there's two pretty polarized views of what the public interest represents, and I'll leave it to you to decide which one you like better. So what are the timber companies' real interests here? We're talking about profits. Here's 2018 profits for some publicly traded companies. Interfor, 111.7 million. Canfor, 221.8 million. Canfor Pulp, 89.5 million. Canfor did pretty well there. West Fraser, though, 378 million. So while closing mills, buying mills outside of BC, and whining about how they need lower stumpage, that's what happened. So the government felt so desperate by it, they shelled out 69 million in a bailout not too long ago, which was largely about supporting the companies, billed as supporting forest workers. But if you're really going to support forest workers, then you better deal with some of that yellow stuff in the center of the screen. And you better deal with standards and accountability and things like that. Some short-term money for short-term jobs is not going to fix that. So we have a shrinking timber supply. We prop up quote-unquote sustainable forestry by cutting younger and younger trees, more and smaller trees. So as that happens, and employment revenue shrinks, companies are heading south and east. In 2015, Canfor to Mississippi, these are just a few examples. West Fraser to Florida and Georgia in 2017, Canfor to Sweden in 2018. And both of those companies are, the latter two are increasing their US holdings, leaving behind at this juncture in 2017, over 20 years, 100 mills closed, timber industry employment shrunk by 22,400 positions. That's some work that Parfit did for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in 2017. Let's add a 2020 update to it. I think something in the order of 26 more mills closed with 6,000 more positions lost. We're not only not treating people very well this way, but we're ignoring what we're good at. Our forests, if we managed our activities right, we would focus on quality and adding value to what we get. That every time I say that, I think of that waste pile of old growth cedar I showed you. Lots of value-added products sitting there. Lots and lots of employment. You can take one of those logs, keeps cabinet making, 4 or 5 cabinet makers busy for years, so you have, and you can produce things that no one else can produce. So we've been sold a bill of goods about short rotation plantation forestry. If for no other reason, it does not suit the biological productivity of about 95% of the forest land base in this province. But it was a really nice way for a small segment of our society to get rich quickly. Sorry to bore you with some long quotes, but these are pretty important ones to me. Again, this is backed up in a lot of places. But we keep talking about the technology to capture and store carbon. Well, standing forests are the only proven system that we know that does that, and they do it better than anything we're going to contrive with technology. And so that's why protecting intact forests, primary and old growth forests, is so critical at this juncture. So if we're going to prevent further emissions, to not only prevent further emissions from fossil fuels, deforestation, forest degradation, and bioenergy, which is another topic that we won't delve deeply into tonight, but it's a big carbon source as well, then we have to expand our forest capacity to remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it long term. That means that stopping deforestation, protecting existing forests, and expanding and restoring degraded forests. If we did that along with taking care of those fossil fuels, we could reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. But we can't do that without a major scale up in forest protection. At a time when we seem to be wanting to finish off the last fragments, this is what logic and science tells us. So we need to rethink that, and I'll give you a few ideas about how to do that. So forestry today at BC still focuses on logging primary and old-growth forests. It's, to sum it up, the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases, causes the largest loss of biological diversity, primary cause of water degradation, a major contributor to floods and droughts, even though that's not talked a lot about. And it's less than 2.5% of the gross domestic product and declining. So it's hardly the engine of the economy, and it's eroding a lot of the public interest, those needs that I talked about. So either we're going to change that or Earth will change us. I think that's the pretty stark, clear conclusion you can come to. I want to compare this now with a different jurisdiction. And I want to confess that I'm an expatriate American. I was educated as a forester at Oregon State University and did graduate study at the University of Washington. I know the U.S. system well. I worked there for people like Weyerhaeuser and the like. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I think that U.S. forestry is a paradigm, a virtue or a wonderful example everywhere. But there's a really important difference that underlies some of the things that I've been talking about tonight if we want to fix them. So in 1992, the Northwest Forest Plan, which was developed, that covers U.S. Forest Service lands and has been extended to Bureau of Land Management lands and in some cases state forest lands, required the protection of primary and old-growth forests. After 20 years, that plan was evaluated, and it showed some interesting results. Increased carbon sequestration and storage, improved water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. It protected and restored both of those functions, biological diversity, and lo and behold, we have healthier, more diverse community and regional economies. So I remember at the time there was a hue and cry that came out of the Northwest states that the sky was falling and it was all over for local communities. No, it wasn't. In fact, the benefits far outweighed the messiness, and with a little bit of transition work, now that part of the world, because of those decisions, is in better shape. So why the differences between those two pictures, between the Pacific Northwest and what's going on here today? The most important one is that there's public control of public forests there. We do not have public forests here. We have privatized timber supplies. We have tenures that are replaced or renewed at the discretion of the tenure holder on public land, and the government does not have the right to tell them no. So how public does that make these tenures? Not very public. Sounds like private control. Banks give companies huge amounts of money on our land and our resources because they have confidence in that arrangement that I just described to you. So you tell me, if they didn't think that was virtual private control, would they do that? I don't think so. So the other thing is that there's two kind of competing ways of thinking when it comes to land and our species. We can look at it as a public trust, held in trust for future generations for those ecosystem services we've been talking about, or you can look at it as a resource trust, that it has no value until it's turned into money. unfortunately, I have it from good sources like Eco-Justice and their lawyers, that in Canada, the resource trust trumps the public trust. That again is headed down the wrong path, and it's something all of us can do as individuals to raise that alarm. So accountability is catalyzed by legislation. In the US, there is an excellent Endangered Species Act, although I have to admit that our good friend Donald is busily trying to dismantle this stuff. Don't hide from that. But there's also the National Environmental Policy Act that requires environmental assessments around the forestry that I've shown you. There has to be detailed either environmental assessments, and if that brings up some concerns, then environmental impact assessments, lengthy kinds of analyses. And a National Forest Management Act that provides standards that have to be met. And so these provide accountability for people that are operating in forests. And because of litigation surrounding them, they over time led to more opportunities for cooperation and collaboration amongst local people. And because the timber supply is controlled by the public, then it's not a matter of talking to a timber company. The timber companies bid on the timber that government planners decide is available to be cut. And they also design how it gets cut. And so that bid, private entrepreneurs are put in the right place, in my opinion, and that's to be the efficiency experts within a set of socially and ecologically responsible rules. Socially and ecologically responsible rules. You don't ask the entrepreneurs to make up the rules unless you expect what we've got, and that's what's happened. So the landscape level plan gave priority to protecting ecosystem services and established ecological reserves. So all of those things were known in British Columbia at this time. I was actively involved in the debates, and the BC timber industry lobbies and forest professionals spent huge amounts of money to block those things from happening here. That happened in the late 80s and early 90s. And by and large, they were successful. And then it got worse, which I won't dwell on tonight, but it got worse in the sense of shrinking even what we had at those times. So here's an example of what keeps happening here that happens far less just south of the 49th parallel. This is putting ecological integrity in second place behind timber. That's a headwaters clear cut in a domestic watershed in the Soquel Valley that I can see from my backyard. That was done 3 years ago. You know, that's not being accountable. That's not in the public interest. That's a narrow little focus for a few people at the expense of communities and ecosystems. So let's go back to the climate disruption for a minute and come to grips with what we're facing. Warmer, drier, drought, forest stress. Remember those intact forests and what they do? Think about that when you see these things. That means we're going to shift ecosystems. But ecosystems don't have legs. You don't just call a meeting of them, bring them together in a room and say, okay, now you've got to move up this mountain and get with it. Or you can stay put here as long as you move over to the slightly wetter spot. That's not how it works. It takes, in many cases, centuries for those kinds of adaptations to occur. I've seen ecosystem collapse already in this province. At the drier end, in particular, of ecosystems, I've been in places with indigenous people where both they and I had been in these places enough times where we realized that what was going on there was a change from trees to tree shrubs to degraded shrub communities. Drier end, yes, but everything is getting drier. And with increased fire, that's going to increase the dryness. Fire creates hydrophobic soils, which makes it hard for even the water that you have available to penetrate the soil and keep the system working. So the whole thing we have created is a multiplying effect here. Cumulative effects are getting worse and getting bigger. So decreased water supplies, and a lot of that rests at the decisions that you see here tonight about how we do forestry. This is some really interesting new evidence of forest stress. Drought, tree physiologists have learned, causes air bubbles, or what are called ecological emboli, in water-carrying vessels in trees. And so under severe drought, trees struggle to refill those air bubbles even when you get water back into the system. So, and if you think about it, with capillary action and the way water moves, trees are different in the way they move water. In deciduous trees, there are more forgiving kinds of mechanisms that are called vessels. And in conifers, it's a combination of less efficient mechanisms that are called tracheas and vessels. So, not surprisingly, if you have long, severe drought, you end up with tree deaths and the other things that come along with that. Loss of biodiversity, water conservation, and climate change. And as I explained, it's less problematic in deciduous versus conifers. So where do we really have our money in the bank when it comes to forestry? In conifers, not in deciduous trees. In fact, we are prejudiced towards a lot of really important deciduous trees as though they were unnecessary, when in fact we know that species like species like aspen store the most stable soil carbon, the most long-lasting soil carbon. So there's some interesting kind of connections here between drought, stress, and what's coming down here. So let's focus for a minute on how it got here. Industrial control, what's called the forest tenure system, which really is a timber tenure system. That's what shapes how forestry is done. Legislation, regulations, and policy. Education and research. Huge impacts on education at all levels, right through university. Employment and labor relations. They set the stage. They dictate the tunes, by and large. Why did we get here? Well, I think we need to realize that we have a colonial mindset that's about domination. Rather than being part of, we want to dominate. And the way we dominate is something we call resource management, which is all about exploitation and control, command and control. Command and control, exploitation and control of something we don't understand. Rather than having humility, we have arrogance there. And we've always had minimal accountability that goes along that way. Exclusion, not inclusion. Excluding workers, excluding communities, excluding ecologists, excluding biologists, or putting them in places where they don't really affect this colonial mindset. And we're talking about least cost resource exploitation with low value commodity products. You know, a whole lot of forestry that's called site-specific forestry is really just least cost logging. It's got lots of stuff draped on it, but it's little more than that. And we end up with excessive corporate profits that we talked about at the expense of ecosystems and people. this approach continues today. Where did it come from? Well, in the US, around 1945, there was an interesting trial called the Sheldon Public Sustained Yield Unit. People attempted to set up tenure systems in the US like we now have here. They combined industrial and public land. The result, in their conclusion, was a private monopoly on public land. Important words, because of that, it was rejected. Privatization meant loss of public control. But it was embraced here. And about shortly after that, the first tree farm license, which is the strongest form of timber tenure here, was created, TFL1 in the Nass Valley, an area I'm intimately familiar with because in the early 80s, the NSCA hired me to evaluate that tree farm license in many different ways. That's a story I won't go into, but other than to say that it led to the Ombudsman recommending that the tree farm license be canceled. The only time, to my knowledge, that's ever occurred with a major license in this province. And I had had my report peer reviewed. The Ombudsman had it checked by a third-party forester who said I was cautious, which I was trying to be. The result was the Ombudsman got fired by the legislature, and my professional association accused me of being unethical for saying things like forest mismanagement and that clear cutting doesn't work. So that's kind of the history of where it came from. And it really ended up being short-sighted in all three ways: ecological, social, and economic thinking. But it was pretty visionary from a corporate standpoint. From an narrow interest group, they not only got control, but they were able to keep the illusion of public land, which I think exists with many, many people in this province today. Has it worked? Well, for a while. It appeared to work. Cheap access to old-growth forests, which weren't anything that we had anything to do. They were the products of nature. For a few corporate owners and shareholders, they got a big share, and forest workers. Part of the big social hype was appurtency, build mills, you can have the public resources, and we'll build communities. That could have been done in a very, very different way without losing control of the forests, but it wasn't. So the major cost was ecological degradation, and we're talking about 45,000 jobs lost since 2000 and growing. Why does it continue? Simple. The power of corporate lobbying. I still scratch my head about that one because it's hard to believe that it's such a small part of the GDP. And even when you look at rural communities, it's a much bigger part of a lot of different rural communities. But those communities are not going to survive unless they diversify, period. We need to help them diversify, not cut the last tree, because it's not going to work. Nor is trying to cut younger and younger and smaller trees to the absurd point where you plant a tree one day and 5 days later you pull it out because it's reached financial maturity. You know, I mean, that's we don't want to go down that road. So the other thing that I particularly feel sensitive about is an ominous silence that comes from forest professionals, professional associations, and educators. If you think advocacy is a bad word, then you de facto advocate the status quo. So you better like that. We're all advocates, and we need to advocate for things that are right and truthful. This gets maintained by the corporate spin, things like restructuring. That's what's going on. Replace people with machines. That's a big part of restructuring that generates more profits. Sustainable forestry. What's being sustained? Water, biological diversity, carbon sequestration and storage, caribou habitat? I don't think so. Cutting rates, as I mentioned, are propped up by cutting younger and younger and smaller trees. I read over and over again from corporate lobby groups that we're world leaders in sustainable forestry. How do we measure that? I haven't been able to find out, but that's a nice glossy statement. To some degree, it's how many trees we plant. I already mentioned that you can plant trees, but you can't plant forests. Area clear cut, employment per tree cut, we have the lowest in British Columbia with the best resources, best timber resources of all of Canada. So that doesn't speak very well for employment for tree cut. Protection of ecosystem services? No, let's not try that one on. There's no defense there. Producing value? No. Low value commodity products that we've demonstrated get sold across borders, remanufactured into high valued end products and sold back to us. We're buying back our own trees. Is that good economics? So propping up that corporate control are senior government managers are there with a corporate timber bias. A lot of perverse subsidies. Subsidies are, this could be a source of another whole evening. Professional reliance is a huge subsidy. There's no accountability attached there. No standards to protect forest ecosystem services and non-timber quote-unquote forest values. Ecological degradation is not included. That's externalized. That's sent on to some future generation. And that's an easy one to fix. Lack of information. Boy, we used to have Forest Service annual reports. Now, try to get information about what's going on. Wow, you get these warm, fuzzy generalities on the Ministry of Forest Lands and Everything's website. But those generalities don't give me any information. They don't help me understand that. Timber companies effectively determine stumpage rates. The Americans are right. We have a subsidized stumpage system because we have no free open market. It's a controlled market, an artificial kind of market. The Vernon Log Sort Yard was an attempt by a couple of very thoughtful Ministry of Forest employees in the 90s to take timber cut from the Small Business Forest Enterprise Program, where they asked me and the people that work with me to lay it out so that it met ecological standards. It was, interestingly enough, in the early days before certification kind of got co-opted, and Greenpeace actually certified it based on what they saw as their standards, which you can take for what you want, but it was an interesting opinion. That log sort yard was eventually shut down because it recovered significantly more stumpage per cubic meter by auctioning the logs in about 51 different sorts. And by hand scaling each log, they demonstrated that they accumulated 12 to 15% more volume than if they had used weight scaling. So another interesting subsidy. In other words, I have no doubts that a bunch of the wood that goes out of our forests goes out free of charge, essentially. So I mentioned that, no log markets. Here's an example on Haida Gwaii. In 1988, Gwaii-Hannes, we compensated timber companies for cutting rights, private or public forest land, public resources, $100 million. Boy, you know, that, and think about that, that was in 1988 dollars. Something's missing from that picture if we can essentially give companies rights and then they can turn around and say back to us, now you owe us compensation for taking back some of those rights. We'll touch on that at the end here in a moment. So silviculture, restoration, wildfire resilience, product marketing, they're all public expenses. And so good ideas to do, but where's the money? You know, it's locked up somewhere else. And finally, this control is propped up by easy access for corporate interests to government decision makers. And that curbs access for non-timber interests. But what's coming at you right now is something even more Orwellian, in my opinion. How are we solidifying that? The government, this new government, this social democratic government, has invited timber companies to set up timber supply area coalitions and be in charge of them. The government will support them with resources. So it's government sanctioned and industry-led. Not a good thing. It's going to become the industrial school of forestry for communities, for First Nations, etc. And it's going to go down the path that I'm talking about to you tonight. Okay, let's tell a different story. It's time. I'm sure that you're as weighted down as I am by now. The Dalai Lama happens to be a hero of mine. I get up every morning and read a little bit about what he has to say about life. This is something that he said some time ago. If humankind continues to approach its problems from the perspective of temporary expediency, future generations will face tremendous difficulties. Well, we need to choose the path then. What path are we going to go down? You've got a choice when it comes to perceptions and ways of being, or that our dominant values can be anthropocentric or human-centered, or our values can be kin-centric or earth-centered. And when an Indigenous person says all my relations, they're not just talking about other people that are their relations, they're talking about the whole system. I'll introduce you by picture to Elizabeth Panashwe, who is an Innu elder that I had the privilege to work with a lot in setting up an Innu Forest Guardians program a number of years ago. Where did we do that? Not in classrooms. We went out in the bush in pole tents, spent weeks at a time living there, sharing Indigenous observation-based knowledge and what Western science I could contribute to that, as well as some observation-based knowledge. So where does that path lead? It starts with a vision for the forest. And that vision is ecological integrity as the first priority. Protect or restore ecological integrity. That has to be kind of written on the wall and be the question that gets asked every time we think about how we're going to carry out an activity. Scientists now are kind of catching up with Indigenous observations and knowledge, where they're saying that we need at least 50% of the planet protected for ecosystem services: air, water, carbon sequestration and storage, biological diversity. And that needs to be well distributed, not put in a park here and practicing thermonuclear forestry over here. That doesn't work. It has to be well distributed at that beginning slide that I mentioned of spatial and temporal scales. And nested between those protected areas, those reserves, you can have ecosystem and cultural, those nested between those ecosystem and cultural reserves, because some of them are going to be there to protect culture, both indigenous and non-indigenous. Then we can define human use areas. And as you'll see, those human use areas are what generate economies. So the other thing to say about that vision is that we have to stand back and look at what we're going to do and say, have we balanced human and non-human use? That's the way you evaluate whether you really are being part of that system or dominating it. these are words, are my words, but they're a thought that came from the teaching of many elders. We need to see forests, any ecosystem, as identities to be respected, not objects to be dominated. When I'm home, which is most of the time these days, I go for a walk in my little 7-acre forest along the little Spokane River, and I talk with the trees. I've been taught about those kinds of things, and I can't put it into words how you feel in those situations, but it's incredibly renewing and empowering. It feels like what we all need to do each day. So this approach, this vision, is underlaid by an important hierarchy. This is a truth. This is not an assumption of convenience. This is not something that's cooked up. Economies are part of human cultures, and human cultures are part of ecosystems. That's the right hierarchy. So if you take care of ecosystems, you protect land, water, soil, plants, animals, you always have healthy cultures because you're providing right there with their needs. And every healthy culture that's ever existed has an economy. What's an economy? People relating to people providing the goods and services they need, with an emphasis on need, not on wants. And if you doubt that, an ethical neoclassical economist will agree with that in a minute. There's a wonderful book, Slower by Design, Not by Disaster, Managing for or Avoiding Economic Growth, written by Peter Victor, who's a neoclassical economist. And he lays it out really well, the history of economics. He explains throughout history, the only economies that have endured have been land-based, community-based economies. Other quote-unquote economies are special interests that largely, like today's global economy, concentrate wealth and exist at the expense of natural ecosystems and services and local communities. So we have a choice. We can do economies so they fit within that hierarchy. And I'll show you a couple of examples. The other principle that I developed was focus first on what to protect, then on what to use. Boy, little did I know 30 years ago when I kind of had the first draft of those words, how it would change how I saw things. To this day, it continues to be kind of a revelation to me each time I'm reminded of that. So focus first on what to protect our fully functioning ecosystems, from the scale of this darning needle on a bluebell to whole watersheds. So that multiplicity of scale and time that I spoke about. Plans of how to regulate our activities in ecosystem needs to be based on ecological timeframes, not corporate financial appraisals on a quarterly basis or annual profit and loss statements, but timeframes of 250, 500 years and beyond that are precautionary. I'll say it again, that are precautionary in their assumptions, that go back to that vision of maintaining ecological integrity. And so we develop plans for our activities in ecosystems that generations of human beings can live through and modify and tweak as their understanding of their relationship with their surroundings and ecosystems improves. So full cycle plans for salmon, for alder, for water, and as Stan Rowe, who was one of Canada's premier ecologists and a mentor of mine on our board for many years, always reminded me, don't forget about the rocks and minerals, that we need to make sure they're arranged the way we found them as well. So they're alive in many, many cultures. So those priorities are achieved through not only precautionary actions, but identifying and respecting ecological limits. Their ecosystems can tell us a lot about sort of no-go zones, places where if we do things very aggressively, we're going to create long-term ecological debts. What are some of those examples? Shallow soils, very dry or very wet sites, steep and broken slopes. Boy, we ignore that one a lot in many cases. Broken slopes mean like sawtooth. And it's interesting on those slopes that the only moisture that the top of those little ridges get is the annual rainfall. No downslope movement of water and nutrients like in a big topographic landscape. Snow-dominated ecosystems. Wow, another one we ignore. Trees in snow-dominated ecosystems are by nature very uneven aged, and they take centuries to develop partial forest cover over them. And the way that's developed is one tree struggles up through the snow, provides cover for a few additional ones around them, but they always end up being in a tenuous balance with that heavy snow load. So it's a major ecological limit that we kind of trespass on all the time. Unique and rare habitat. We made a lot of that. There's a lot of anthropocentric rare and endangered habitat now that we need to come to grips with. Same thing with threatened and endangered species. And riparian ecosystems get a special spot in my heart because of water. They're a very obvious expression of water. We've talked about why that's important. And finally, old natural forests. It's no problem for me to say that we should not cut down any more intact primary and old-growth forests, period. We are at that place, and I submitted that to the old-growth panel, a lengthy conversation with them, interestingly enough, about a lot of the things that I'm talking about here tonight. I wish them well, because to me, the answer seems pretty obvious. So, how do we do this? We do this through a system of networks of ecological reserves and cultural reserves that happen at multiple spatial scales. I know that's a big mouthful, but we have to go from that big landscape down to the individual patches where we're standing. We have to, first of all, include that, make sure we protect ecological integrity in those networks of ecological reserves, but also cultural integrity. Cultural integrity in the good sense of the word. Cultural integrity that protects ecological integrity or maintains ecological integrity. What does that look like? Well, here's an example of a plan that I have permission to show you part of from the Innu in Labrador. You can recognize this political boundary, what in colonial culture we call Labrador. In Inuamun, it's called the Nitassinan. We help them develop an ecosystem-based conservation plan for an area there of about 7.5 million hectares. There's the large core reserves that we call a protected areas network. The green areas connected with big blue linkages here that are largely built around river systems. And this was a special red wine caribou habitat reserve that the caribou are particularly important to the Innu, as to many indigenous people. And Jim Schaefer, who's for many years been one of Canada's premier caribou biologists and is a professor at Trent University, happened to be the habitat biologist in Happy Valley East Bay when we made this plan. So Jim and I became pretty good friends over that. And he was the one that, along with the Innu, helped shape that large protected area. He has told me, and in a book launch a number of years ago with Maintaining Whole Systems, he said publicly in Toronto that it's only through these kinds of size of protected areas that we can protect caribou. That anything less we're kidding ourselves with. So this, I will, because the evening is moving along here, I'm not going to launch into all the things I know here, but this shows you the multiple